Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to our discussion of Humankind Chapter 4. So first of all, make sure that before you watch this video, you have read Chapter 4 in the book Humankind, and that as you read it, you take handwritten notes to help you learn from it, remember what's in there, and prepare for the quiz and the exam, which will be next week. So I also recommend that once you've read the chapter and you've come back to this video and you're watching it, that you take handwritten notes on this video to help you with the quiz that you'll take after it. So a reminder to both read the chapter, watch this, and then a reminder to take the quiz after this video. And never fear if your quiz score is not exactly what you wanted or hoped, because there are lots of extra credit opportunities. And you check the announcements to see what new opportunities you have at present. And all right, let's get into chapter 4. So overall in this book, Humankind, we are engaged in a debate of ideas and using evidence as critical thinkers to help us sort through competing ideas. And the competing ideas that we're working with can largely be characterized by the claims of two major philosophers that we've talked about in past videos. One is Thomas Hobbes, and the other is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Thomas Hobbes, as we talked about earlier, is famous for the idea that it's civilization that keeps humans under check, and that if we didn't have civilization to control us, we would in fact revert to some innate, brutish, violent, selfish nature that is within all of us and is our true way of being, but that civilization puts a cap on and holds and controls. And that idea is broadly called realism. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on the other hand, believed that it's not that society and civilization and the control of the authority that civilization brings actually puts a cap on or a veneer over our horrible inner natures that are naturally brutish and violent, but rather that naturally we are good and we want to connect with other humans, and we are instead turned into more selfish, more greedy, and more warlike people because of civilization, not despite civilization. So not that civilization helps us be better, but that civilization actually makes us worse as humans. It motivates us to be greedy. It motivates us to compete with each other. It motivates us towards things like war. So we have two very different sets of ideas about what is true for humans. And we have to ask ourselves as critical thinkers, well, they have all these ideas, but what evidence do they have? So we've talked about that a little bit in the past chapters. We're going to be talking about that again for this chapter and the chapter ahead. What evidence is there for these two different theories, these two different models, these two different sets of ideas about who humans are inside? What is our nature? And what's our relationship like to civilization? Does civilization make us better, or does it actually make us worse? It's a very interesting debate. So let's look at the evidence, but we first have to ask ourselves, to be able to answer this kind of question, what sort of evidence would we need in the first place? What evidence is relevant to this bigger question about human nature as a whole? Not just humans who are here today, but what are humans like more generally? Humans in the past, proto-humans, humans that were our ancestors before we became fully human, so that we can then understand who we are as a species and understand more about our relationship to ourselves in the present, who we are today in relationship to this long evolution that then shapes our possibilities for who we can be as humans in the future. It's a really fascinating set of questions to deal with. So what kind of evidence would be relevant there? Well, one of the forms of evidence that would be relevant to thinking about the species as a whole and our nature as a whole then would be evolutionary evidence, asking questions based on the fossil record as to what our ancient ancestors, not just our human ancestors, but those that came before our human ancestors, who gave rise to our human ancestors, what were they like? And if we were to believe Hobbes, we would think that over the course of evolution, we became less and less brutish and violent and more civilized and cooperative and controlled. We were no longer cavemen, but we were instead office women, so to speak. So that's a set of ideas that would support what Hobbes would say. So in that line, there was an anthropologist, a famous Australian anthropologist in 1924, who proposed in relationship to Hobbes's idea about humans becoming better over time and therefore having been worse in the past. He proposed what's often called the killer ape theory. He found an ancient ancestor of humans. It wasn't itself human, but it would have been in our evolutionary background. So it would have spoken to what we used to be and what we have become. And he looked at the way in which these bones had, the individual that had been these bones at one time when it was alive, how it would have died based on the evidence from the damage done to the bones, like what had happened to the bones. And he interpreted the bones and said, oh, clearly these are the marks from weapons wielded by other proto-humans. So clearly this is the effect of battle and war. Therefore, clearly our ancestors were once quite violent. That if we're finding bones that died by violence between proto-humans, then that would be an indication, that would be evidence to support the idea that proto-humans were naturally violent. And it was a very popular theory. But we need to ask ourselves, okay, he was considered a very important, prominent scientist, anthropologist of his time, but what was the context in which his ideas were being formed? Because as critical thinkers, we always have to be self-reflexive. We have to look at ourselves and think, why is it that I think the things that I think? Where did these ideas come from? So we have to ask about Raymond Dart's ideas. Where did his ideas come from? So let's look a little bit at the context of what was happening in 1924 when he made this hypothesis of the killer ape theory. Long before Dart created his killer ape theory, there was in Europe a prevalent idea that's often called the great chain of being. It's an idea that there is a hierarchy of organisms within creation, and that God is at the top of all creation, and just beneath God, the closest thing to God, is humans. Humans are better than, smarter than, more ethical, more civilized, more intelligent than all of the organisms that come below them. So we get better and better and better as organisms until we get up to God, and then humans are almost like God. So this idea of humans being somehow more evolved, more moral, more intelligent, more worthy than all other species then took a second turn when humans started to think about, Europeans started to think about that in relationship to humans related to each other. So not just how do humans relate to the animals that are beneath them in this idea of the great chain of being, but how do humans relate to other humans? And this is where the scientific theories of racism began. Scientists and philosophers started to say some humans are better, more evolved, more civilized, more intelligent, more moral than other humans. And they created vast fields of science to try and support their idea that some humans were more evolved and better than other humans. And you can see from the picture on the side that this was written into science in a way that science continues to be written today. This is like a textbook picture of the idea that certain skulls from different species and then from different races of humans could show us that some humans are more evolved than other humans. Their brain casing could somehow indicate more intelligence, more morality, more civilization. So we have this continuity between the idea of the great chain of being, think about this as a form of availability bias, to scientific racism, and then even more elaborated and more detailed versions of scientific racism, which I'll show you on the next slide. So scientific racism became a highly elaborated and detailed theory that even differentiated Europeans from other Europeans. So Europeans said, okay, we are at the top of the great chain of being as white people. We are better than non-white people. And in non-white people, they included people like the Irish and the Iberians, the people from Britannia, all of the Gaelic peoples who were, by our standards today, white. But at that time, the British considered them to be actually of African descent. Well, of course, all humans are of African descent. They didn't understand that at the time. They marked them scientifically as closer to Africans and therefore lower on the great chain of being more intelligent, more moral, more close to God. So this set of ideas about being more civilized based in science, I put quotes to show you that it's not. It was talked about as if it were science, but in fact it is not objective science. It was the very context in which Raymond Dart, the scientist working with and interpreting the bones from proto-humans, was operating. These were the ideas that were available to him. These were the single stories about human progress and hierarchy and being more civilized, more intelligent, and closer to God that were pervading the way in which he interpreted what he found. So he had ideas that were available to him, and he projected them onto, and they shaped the way he saw the evidence from the bones around him. And so with those ideas easily available to him, he interpreted those bones as necessarily conforming to that single story of humans having evolved to be better and less brutish and less and more civilized and more intelligent as things went on. Therefore, proto-humans, ancient humans, by that theory, must have been more violent. And so he interpreted those bones as showing evidence of violence between proto-humans. The truth, as we know, was that, in fact, ultimately, it was a predator from a totally different species that killed that proto-human that he was analyzing. It was a bird of prey. It was a bird. It wasn't another proto-human that committed the violence. So it wasn't that we were violent against ourselves. It's that we were, in fact, that particular proto-human happened to have been the prey of a large bird. So then what do we make of this idea that evolutionary evidence can support Hobbes, that we went from being something more violent, less intelligent, and less civilized than we are today, and that it is in fact we are in fact now, because of civilization, living out our best life? Well, today, paleoanthropologists who analyze bones, unlike Raymond Dart, would say that's not what the available evidence from the bones of ancient humans would show us. It does not show us that they were engaged in wars at the same level that we are today. It does not show us that they murdered each other at the same rates that we do today. It does not show us anything about them having been more competitive with each other. So our ideas about ancient cavemen having been dangerous and sort of scary, in fact, is not borne out in the available evidence from ancient bones, ancient grave sites, ancient cave paintings, until later. And we'll get to that in chapter 5. But the available paleoanthropological evidence does not support this idea of becoming somehow more civilized and less violent over time. There's no indication of that at present. Okay, so what other kinds of evidence could be used to help us sort out this debate between Hobbes and Rousseau? Who actually is right based on the evidence, not based on their ideas, but based on what their ideas, how well their ideas are grounded in the reality of evidence that we have. So another form of evidence that we can go to try and think about what were ancient humans like, because that can tell us a lot about our nature based on evolution. We can go to hunter-gatherers who still live today, because hunter-gatherers as a form of human living and human thriving and existing on the planet have not ceased. They have continued, that form of life have continued from prehistoric times until today. Although today there are very, very, very few and only tiny pockets of people who are not already folded into the globalization of capitalism and capital flows. So there are very few people who are still living a sort of pristine hunter-gatherer life, but there were more of them in recent decades, and anthropologists did go out to such people who were not integrated into a globalized society yet, and they studied them, they lived with them, they found out what their lives were like, the way that they structured their societies, how they talked to each other, how they felt, how they were human, in what ways they were human. This is interesting, important evidence for us because it helps us think about what we could be like, what's natural to us evolutionarily, without the trappings of civilization, without the way in which we live in Long Beach today. What could we be like as humans? Because there's other humans on the planet who are continuing to live like that. So what's still possible for us in our nature? So this is all called ethnographic evidence from hunter-gatherers. Why hunter-gatherers specifically? Because we as humans lived for hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers. So if we look at the way hunter-gatherers lived in recent times, that'll tell us a lot about what hunter-gatherers could have been like in the past as well, which is how we all evolved, was as hunter-gatherers. So what do we find from such people? We're going to spend a lot more time on this in the next chapter, but there are two main studies that he talks about in this chapter 4, Rutger Bregman brings up. One from the 1960s and 70s on the Kong, who live in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa in places like Botswana and Namibia, and are range for a very large part of Central Africa. They range across a large part of Central Africa. And in this era, an anthropologist named Elizabeth Marshall Thomas went out and found that the Kong people that she lived with were very peaceful, that there were not a lot of wars, there was not murder between these people, there wasn't the kind of violence that we experience in civilized society. And that instead of using violence or threats of violence to be able to keep people in check, that what the Kong did was, in fact, to use forms of social engagement to keep people cohesive. So they would check people who got a little out of hand by teasing them, by gossiping about them, by shaming them, but not by having fistfights and killing each other or going to war. That wasn't typically how people controlled people. They did it through soft, subtle social cues to each other. And they were largely able to stay cohesive. And when people didn't get along, they usually solved it if social cues weren't working, they usually solved it by redistributing themselves into other groups, basically moving away from each other, but that they weren't particularly violent. But note that just like we had to think about in Dart's case, what was the context in which Dart was creating his ideas, which were part of scientific racism. We have to think about also, what about Elizabeth Marshall Thomas's ideas? What was the context in which she was writing this as well? And we have to note that this was the era of the 60s and the 70s in which people in the United States and in Europe many people were very interested in thinking about how to be peaceful with each other. How can we change the way that society is structured altogether? What can we learn about people who don't have hierarchy between them? So this is the era of hippies, basically. So we have to think about, to what extent was Elizabeth Marshall Thomas's context shaping the way in which she was writing. In contrast to Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, we have a very famous ethnography written on the Yanomamo in Brazil, the Brazilian rainforest, by an anthropologist called Napoleon Chagnon. And Chagnon was writing in the 1980s when there was an increased interest in competition and capitalism and getting ahead and one-upmanship on each other. And Chagnon was very interested in showing that, in fact, hunter-gatherers are not peaceful the way that Elizabeth Marshall Thomas claimed, but in fact they're quite violent, and that would then indicate that we as humans more generally are also quite violent, since most, all of us came out of this history of mostly being hunter-gatherers until we started to create agrarian societies, and we saw the advent of farming, etc., which we'll get into the next chapter. So he wanted to show that, in fact, the Yanomamo were extremely warlike and violent, and that's exactly what he found. But he did it with a whole bunch of statistics and logical analysis of statistics, which don't hold up to analysis, don't hold up to further analysis. So he did things that were also ethically questionable, like he wanted to find that the Yanomamo were violent, and he handed out a bunch of axes to them when he got there. Also, he did a lot of mistakes in terms of prioritizing certain cases that were not representative of the larger group, and his math and his calculations were off as a result. So he prioritized older people and said, look, they have more children and they're also violent, therefore being violent allows you to produce more children. But they actually had more children just because they were older, not because they were more violent. And he also excluded the fact, so confirmation bias, by cherry picking only data that you want, excluding data that you don't want. He excluded cases of people who had children and were violent, but were killed because they were violent. He didn't include their cases at all. So he only included cases of people who were violent and lived, not cases of people who were violent and died. So his claim that being violent helps you succeed, get ahead, and have more children, therefore is evolutionarily beneficial, actually didn't hold up to scrutiny later on. But what's so interesting about this is what we'll talk about on the next slide. What's so interesting about these contrasting sets of scientific studies of hunter-gatherers is that one of them became far, far, far more famous than the other. And that, as you might guess, was the one by Napoleon Chagnon about the Yanomamo being so violent and dangerous. So why can we assume that it became so popular? Why is it that the news media picked up on it and repeated Napoleon Chagnon's findings ad nauseum? Why is it that so many people bought his book? Why the fascination on the idea that humans are murderers, and much less attention to the idea that humans are actually quite peaceful? And if you think about it, this is a form of negativity bias. And just as Bregman says in the book, news media go out and they survey the scientific literature that's out there. And rather than reporting on scientific literature in a representative way, they instead pick the negative examples that are a little more exciting, a little more racy, because they involve death and violence. So they pick the negative examples and they use them as a hasty generalization for the totality of the scientific data and analysis that's available. What makes them do that? Because we as humans have a negativity bias. We are more interested in the scary, the bloody, the shocking than we are in the peaceful and that which is not alarming to us. So the news media wants to give us the things that we want, to be shocked, to be horrified, to be a little scared. So they pick up those stories and they reject the other kinds of stories. Negativity bias in us then drives the negativity bias of the news media and then makes it difficult for us as everyday people to know what's actually happening in the scientific literature. What do scientists actually think? Because the news media doesn't report it in a straightforward way. They instead just pick out what is negative in or scary in those scientific reports. So let's go back to this question of a larger body of evidence. We have the Yanomamo and we have the Kong as two single examples of ethnographic studies about hunter-gathering people. There's another really famous book written by the psychologist Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And Steven Pinker doesn't himself do any scientific data collection and analysis in relationship to this question of the history of human civilization and the data that's available about hunter-gatherers. Instead, what he does is gather other people's studies and interpret their studies himself to come up with his own, what we would call a meta-analysis. So he is analyzing other analyses. So Steven Pinker looks at a variety of data existing from anthropologists and archaeologists, and he, based on his analysis of their work, he says that he believes violence has actually declined throughout history, that humans were much more violent in the past, and that through civilization, we have become the better angels of our nature. Our nature was brutish and violent, but we have surmounted or evolved out of that through the cultural necessities of living in complex societies. So complex societies have helped us to put down our demons and become the better angels. So whose idea does this sound like? Society has helped us evolve to be better. Sounds like Hobbes, right? That's pretty straightforwardly Hobbes' idea. So let's look at the evidence itself. First of all, we have to think about who Steven Pinker is. He is a very famous Harvard professor who is a psychological expert in experimental work. So he is trained to go into a lab environment as a psychologist, set up experiments, and then analyze the data that he gets from the experiments right in front of him in a lab setting. So let's think about that in terms of his training and his expertise. Does that kind of training, a PhD in experimental psychology, does that make him an expert in anthropology, archaeology, ethnography, which are the data that he's analyzing? Does he have the training necessary to analyze those kinds of data in an expert way? No, he does not. He's an expert in experimental psychology. He's not an expert in paleoanthropology, archaeology, ethnography. Two different lanes. So Steven Pinker, despite being very famous, is not sticking in his expert lane. Let's put that out there straight and right at the top. Number two. Well, let me go back to that point. So I've mentioned you should always ask yourself, who is this person whose stuff I'm reading? Who are they? What are their qualifications? What does that tell me about, to what extent should I believe them or not? Right? We talked about that with Rutger Bregman. We should think about that with any particular theorist or any particular scientist who we are coming up against. Like, who is this person? To what extent is their opinion actually a form of authority, or to what extent are they actually not an authority, and therefore believing them would be a form of appealing to authority that they don't have an appeal to authority, a fallacious appeal to authority. Okay, so in contrast to the psychologist Steven Pinker, archaeologists, therefore expert in these things, archaeologist Brian Ferguson, he went and he reanalyzed what Pinker had brought forward as data that showed that we had become less violent over time as humans. And he says, in fact, no, Steven Pinker cherry-picked examples that are not representative. So confirmation bias, right? He just picked the things he liked and didn't pick the other things. He also said he didn't really understand what he was analyzing because he didn't have a complete expert set of skills to be able to analyze it properly. So he was misinterpreting a lot of the data that he did interpret. And current archaeologists and anthropologists believe that, in fact, we haven't become progressively less violent over time, but that instead society developed war as it became more complex. We were less warlike earlier, and we have become more warlike as society itself has become more complex. So think about if we were to claim that humans have become less violent over time based on Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Human Nature, and that was our reason. Steven Pinker says that we are less violent, and he did this analysis. Would that be an appeal to authority? Would it be a logical fallacy? All right. What's also interesting to note is that Bregman, the author of this book, had actually believed and cited and circulated Steven Pinker's ideas about humans getting better over time in his own earlier books, the books that he wrote himself prior to Humankind, the book that we're reading right now. So Bregman had believed Pinker, and he had recirculated those ideas. Now, as he comes back to this question of what is the core of human nature, and he revisits the experts who have analyzed, deconstructed Pinker's work and said, Pinker's not an expert. Pinker's also done all of these things wrong in his analysis that make it useless and make it inaccurate. As Bregman found those new analyses of data and ideas that he had believed from Steven Pinker, he actually pauses in the book on page 85 and he says, wow, did I make a mistake? I believed this guy and I cited him in my own books. Now I find out I'm actually wrong and I need to write another book to actually make up for my former mistake. So note, he finds the mistake, recognizes it for what it is, and he changes his opinion based on this new information and this new analysis that he has, which is a perfect example of what we've talked about in past videos that I'm asking for you to try and develop in your own life: self-reflexivity. He's able to look at himself, realize his mistakes, and change what he believes so that it better fits the evidence and the analyses that are available and that are higher quality than what he once believed. He once believed Steven Pinker knew what he was talking about. He found out he was wrong, and he accepted that and changed what he thought. It was highly self-reflexive. All right, so we were talking about kinds of data that we could use and that Bregman's using in this book to answer this question between Hobbes and Rousseau. Are we brutish by nature and civilization saves us, or are we peaceful and cooperative by nature and civilization ruins us? Going back and forth between these two ideas, we talked about we could look at the ancient bones or the paleoanthropological data that's out there of humans, or we could look at ethnographic data from humans that are hunter-gatherers today and therefore living lives like ancient humans would have lived. He also notes that we could look at, to think about what humans are like when civilization gets ripped away from us, we could look at data from wars. So wars are a moment in time when, in fact, the veneer is ripped off. We're supposed to be as violent as possible. So he looks at that as well. And also, as we've noted in other chapters, he looks at what happens to humans when the band-aids get ripped off and we're in the middle of a catastrophe. Civilization is no longer there to be a veneer, but instead we are on our own in the midst of a catastrophe. What happens to us? So we've looked in this video at paleoanthropological data, we've looked at ethnographic data. What does the historical data from wars tell us? So the first person to note the phenomenon that soldiers don't want to fire their weapons, even in the midst of a battle, was someone named Colonel Marshall. And he, in 1946, developed a hypothesis that goes like this. I'll read it straight from the book. Colonel Marshall's hypothesis, which is a theory of how things work. He says that the average and normally healthy individual has such an inner and usually unrealized resistance to killing a fellow man that he will not, of his own volition, take life. Most people have a fear of aggression that is a normal part of our emotional makeup. So Colonel Marshall, to this question of what are we like on the inside when civilization isn't controlling us, he says, even in the moments in which civilization wants to push us to be violent, our natural inclination, by and large, not everybody, but the majority of us, is to not be violent, to not kill someone else, even if they are construed as our enemy. What did he base this hypothesis on? He based this on a lot of data that he saw in wars in World War II, where he was finding that a lot of soldiers did not fire their weapons, or a lot of people who were in aircraft and were supposed to be firing guns from aircraft, in fact, did not. That all of the deaths in battles were largely attributable to just a small group of people. So a small group of people did most of the killing, and the majority of people, whether they were soldiers or whether they were fighter pilots, most of them never even shot their guns. So Bregman takes this idea from Colonel Marshall and he looks into the controversy over Marshall's techniques, his tactics, his statistics, and he says, yeah, there's some basic problems there, but the meat of what he says is actually borne out by other studies as well. And this is a really important thing as a critical thinker, is not just to say, is that one study right, but does that one study also have other studies that support it as well? So do we have multiple voices of authority that are forming a consensus around an idea? This is a really key part of being a critical thinker. So Bregman pulls research from historians who've looked at the Civil War, historians who've looked at the Napoleonic Wars, and more from historians who've looked at World War II. Those are the sources that he's largely using, the context in which they're largely analyzing this question of, are soldiers firing their guns or not? And those are the contexts. The form of data that he's largely drawing are from first-hand reports from commanding officers who were watching whether their men are firing their guns or not. That's one form. He's also, in Marshall's case, looking at focus group interviews where people together remember what happened during the battle and they think about who did what, and they collect that so they get a narrative, a shared narrative of what happened during the battle. And then there's also this interesting form of physical evidence from the Civil War and the Napoleonic Wars from the guns left after the battle. So guns that were left on the battlefield, then collected and analyzed. And what historians have found is that the majority of those guns had not been fired, or sometimes had multiple balls rammed into them in the case of the Civil War. And through analysis realized that the reason why they had multiple bullets, multiple balls in the rammed into them was so that the soldiers could not shoot, but look like they were doing something instead of shooting. So they would just like reload their muskets in order to be able to distract from the fact that they weren't shooting. So the various forms of data from a variety of people who've analyzed Civil War, Napoleonic Wars, and World War II, according to Bregman, and that's the authority that we have to go on here, seem to indicate that yes, it's true what Colonel Marshall found. Even if Colonel Marshall's study wasn't perfect, Colonel Marshall seems to have landed on a greater truth, which is that most people, even when the veneer is ripped off, even then they choose not to be violent. They don't want to kill other humans, so that our inner nature is not quite so brutal as Hobbes would have us believe. Okay, so we've got the paleoanthropological data, we've got the ethnographic data, we have historical data from wars, and we have historical data from catastrophes. Think back to something like Hurricane Katrina or 9/11, or the Blitz in Britain. The way that people, in fact, cooperated and took care of each other rather than trying to prey and kill each other in a context in which civilization wasn't working anymore. The forms of authority and safety that we're used to weren't there. But humans didn't turn into zombies and start trying to attack each other. Instead, they did the opposite. They took care of each other in very poignant ways. So these are all forms of data that Bregman analyzes that seem to point to the fact that Hobbes doesn't have much of a evidentiary leg to stand on, and Rousseau's ideas about what we're like internally and what we're like without civilization in particular seem to be stacking up more in Rousseau's favor, like we've talked about in earlier videos.